Welcome back to the Bard Spotlight. This time around, we're going to be focusing on Bard's single damaging ability, his Q, Cosmic Binding. In this video, I'm going to first touch on what makes this spell so incredible, and then I'll explain with examples how to find the greatest success when casting this ability. So let's get started. Bard's Q, Cosmic Binding, is nothing short of his champion-defining spell. Well, other than his magical journey. Or his ult. Anyways, his Q is really good, trust me. So what does it do? Cosmic Binding throws out a skill shot that damages the first enemy hit and slows them for 60%. When it hits, however, it sends out another burst of energy behind that first target and seeks secondary targets. If this hits an enemy or a wall, both are stunned instead of slowed. On a very low cooldown, 7 seconds at rank 5, 3.85 seconds with 45% cooldown reduction. Even without considering the stun hitting, it's still a strong single target damage spell with a significant 60% slow for 1.8 seconds. Think of something like Brahm's Q. Now factor in the potential to stun and damage 2 targets, and this spell becomes one that can decide an early or late game fight on its own. Literally, flash into the perfect position to land a 2-man stun on 2 priority targets, and with proper follow-up, the fight, or the game for that matter, may already be decided. These are some of the more obvious and easily analyzed aspects of the spell. Things like cooldown, damage, CC values, they're all very observable and easily understood. But I want to go deeper and consider more in order to fully grasp the potential of this spell. So, what else is there to consider? Well, why don't we look at the range? The initial cast of Cosmic Binding has a range of 950, and then the secondary projectile has 450 range, totaling for a range of 1400. This is insanely long range, equal to a fully charged Xerath Q. There are other things to consider as well. What about the speed of the projectile? Well, the projectile speed is 1500, which is a pretty arbitrary value, but we can compare it to other more well-known spells and note that it's 25% faster than a binding from Lux or Morgana. And that's a pretty fast speed, which makes it harder to react to. And lastly, even though it's a very abstract concept, I feel like this is one of the most powerful points of this spell. The unexpected factor. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, simply put, people don't play around things that they don't expect. Bard's Q is a perfect example of this concept. During a close quarters skirmish, enemies will be well aware of dodging your Q to avoid taking large bursts of damage. In lane, however, you'll find it much easier to land stuns by bouncing Qs off of creeps to hit unsuspecting enemies at well over 1000 range away. Which leads us perfectly into our next segment, how to find the greatest success when using this ability. While I can confidently say that this spell takes a lot of practice and getting used to before it can be mastered, which essentially speaks to Bard in his entirety, here are some things you should try to consider while learning. Let's start off with the most basic ways to use the spell, and then we can look for more creative ways to use it and try to explain why they work. Sometimes keeping it simple is best. Bard's Q does a considerable amount of damage attached to a large slow. Don't be afraid to use it as such, instead of waiting for that stun opportunity that'll never present itself. Sometimes, in all-in skirmishes, the damage is all you need. Alternatively, if you're scared of not being able to hit your Q in these situations, as I mentioned in my previous video about Bard's passive, try pegging your enemy with a meep to slow them down, allowing for an easier shot. And this way of using Q is effective in all-in fights when any amount of damage is very relevant. When you start to roam and try to find ganks, however, you're going to want to look for that stun rather than the raw damage in order to better help your team follow up. If possible, try to find a good angle of attack, and if you're able to pressure your enemy enough to make them retreat, chances are they're going to eventually back themselves into some type of terrain, which is exactly what you've been waiting for. Now these are some of the straightforward uses of the spell, but let's try to get creative with it. Bard's Q has some interesting properties that aren't very obvious at first glance. As I explained, upon hitting a target, a secondary projectile appears behind them. Now, it's really important here to note that this secondary projectile does not center themselves on the model of whatever got hit, but rather it acts as if the first part of the skill pierced straight through them. This is very important because it means that the angle at which you aim and hit your Q on an enemy may determine whether or not you'll get that stun against a unit that's behind them. Let's look at some examples to see what I'm talking about. So here we have the ideal example to achieve a two-man stun. One champion is standing right behind the other and within 450 range. This is the easiest example. When Ezreal's standing to the right side, however, the same Q that worked before now misses. We can see the secondary projectile pierce straight through Karma and whiff on Ezreal. But now, notice how in this situation, while Bard's position hasn't changed, he's able to aim his Q so that it just barely clips Karma on her right side, and in doing so, it pierces through at an angle and hits Ezreal behind her even though he's standing off to the side. This is one of the fundamental strategies in landing stuns on enemies that think they're safe because they're standing off to the side. Though it does come with a risk. Aiming your Q at a tight angle to clip the model of a unit requires much more accuracy and thus isn't very reliable on moving targets such as champions. This strategy is best used on stationary minions during the laning phase. There's actually one more cool aspect of the Q that I want to talk about. It's the Skillshots Width. Now, of course, with any skill shot, a bigger width is very powerful because it essentially covers more ground, which gives you an easier chance to hit it. But it actually means more than that with Bard's Q. So as we know, Bard's Q has the potential to interact with two targets. So what happens if we use our Q and it hits two champions at the same time, one of each side of the Q's width? Well, it's going to look something like this. This happens because while it looks like the Q is hitting both champions at the same time, Bard's Q mechanic means that it can only have one initial target and one secondary target, meaning that one of the champions will be hit first, if only by milliseconds, and then be stunned against the other champion. This is how we're able to achieve these sideways looking stuns. Another powerful tactic, which even further accentuates this idea of getting unexpected stuns. So now we've learned a couple of cool ways to get long range stuns against unexpected enemies. But just as a general note, Bard takes advantage of the high threat and pressure that he exerts in order to land these perfect kind of stuns. Bard's Q becomes easiest to hit when the enemy team is all focused on the same targets. Knowing this, Bard can actually position aggressively and bait the enemy to focus all on him in order to make it easier to land these kind of two-man stuns. All in all, this has been a lengthy analysis on Bard's Q. I hope that after watching this video, you may better understand the beauty and potential that lies hidden within Bard's cosmic binding. If you guys don't already know, this is the second video I've made within this Bard Spotlight series. If you haven't already checked out the first one about his passive, I suggest you do, as I'll be doing more individual videos like these for Bard's 3 other spells. As always, I appreciate any feedback you guys have, as I just started making these videos recently, and I'm always looking for ways to improve them, make them easier to follow and understand. Feel free to ask any questions that you have in the comments, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. And most importantly, hope you guys were able to take something away from this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.